Well, welcome to our second creative thinking event here at the Village Chapel. My name is Kim Thomas. I'm the curate here at the Village Chapel, and we're glad to have you here. Our mission for these gatherings is to inspire, inform, and encourage creative thinking from a biblical perspective. And we'll have creative thinkers of all kinds and makers of all designs who will visit with us and speak about their various mediums, dialogue with us about that, and in hopes of engaging you on several topics like the imagination, creativity, writing, what is art, what is beauty, and why is all of that important? The creative thinker has the task of expressing truth, goodness, and beauty. And the Christian purveyor of these things has the honor of doing so as one who sees through the grace of redemption. Whether one is expressing the twists and shadows of the human form, like our last guest, Ross Wilson, or the challenges disruptions bring for individuals, as expressed by a mainstream writer, as our guest is tonight, we need every single art form to display the aspects of God's glory in all of their many forms of excellence. Calvin described this world, created, sustained, and ruled by God's providence, as the theater of God's glory. Abraham Kuyper said that the redeeming Christ declares, "There is not one square inch of this creation that isn't mine." So let me introduce you to tonight's guest, who is speaking in yet another of those square inches to the glory of God and for the good of his neighbor. Patrick Leddin, PhD. You earn those letters, so you gotta use them, you know. For more than 3 decades, Patrick has been leading teams and studying leadership. His hands-on leadership experience has stretched from leading soldiers as a U.S. Army master parachutist, infantry ranger, qualified officer, to working with senior corporate leaders at KPMG Consulting, by the way, which is one of the big 4 management consulting firms in the country, Franklin Covey, and his own companies. A couple of bullets here, short form. His creativity extends across several networks. Wall Street Journal best-selling author and Amazon #1 new release in workplace culture, author for his book, The 5-Week Leadership Challenge. Successful entrepreneur that has co-founded 2 businesses with his lovely wife, Jamie. Raise your hand, Jamie. Including the Leddin Group, LLC, and the Wedgwood Group, Inc., an Inc. 5,000 company, which was sold in 2012. Associate professor and director of the practice of business studies at Vanderbilt University, where he teaches corporate strategy, negotiation, advanced marketing, and crisis leadership. That's a basketful. He received his PhD in strategic communication from the University of Kentucky, and he and Jamie live in Nashville, where they also have children and a grandbaby. They have 2 adult children, and he is an avid outdoorsman and mountain climber, including Mount Kilimanjaro. Tonight, his focus will be to speak to us on his upcoming book with James Patterson, another Vanderbilt alumni, who happens to hold the New York Times record for most #1 New York Times bestsellers by a single author, which is also a Guinness World Record. The working title is Disrupt Everything. It works on the premise that disruptions will occur in life. How you respond when they do is what makes all the difference. Patrick will talk with us about the book, about his creative process, and how his faith makes a difference in what he does. So, without further ado, a TVCer and a talented creative individual, Patrick Leddin.
Thank you, Kim. You may want to keep that close, Kim, in case you want to play solitaire as I talk for a little bit. Yeah, okay. So it's an honor to be here tonight. I know we say that a lot in today's world. It's an honor and a privilege. I see that all over like LinkedIn or whatever it might be. It is an honor and a privilege to spend some time with all of you tonight. And I was thinking about it when Kim asked me if I would do this. There was part of me that thought, yeah, I'm creative. I've done some things. I've produced some things and they've done okay out there in the world. So maybe I'm the right guy to do this. And then the other part of me thought, I'm not really that creative. And I've messed up so many things, and I don't know how well my process is actually formed at times, and maybe I'm the exact wrong person to do this. And perhaps it's a combination of those two things, a bit of realization that maybe I'm the right guy for tonight, and the realization that I'm also probably the wrong guy for tonight, that might make this just work out perfectly fine. So I thank all of you on a rainy night for coming out to spend some time with us. And I know Kim has some questions for me, and certainly we'll take questions from the group if there are any in the room. And I'm not shy. I'll talk about anything you want to talk about. But I thought it might be helpful because what often draws people's attention to me, if at all, is the project I'm doing with Jim Patterson right now. And he does go by Jim Patterson. So many of you may know his name. If you're not familiar with his name, go in a bookstore or flip through Amazon's fiction section for sure. He usually has one or two in the top 10 or 20. He's written well over 100 New York Times best-selling books. He has sold more than 600 million book copies. There is the expression that no one gets rich writing books. I can testify that I know of one person who gets rich writing books, and it's James Patterson. He's sold more book copies than Grisham and Stephen King combined, which is pretty amazing. So my interactions with him started about 2.5 years ago. Kim mentioned that I teach over at Vanderbilt and I run the undergraduate business program. And one of the courses I've taught over the years is leading through crisis. And it was just kind of a very coincidental, or maybe it was a God thing, that right around the time I was into my second semester of teaching this leading in crisis class, which started during COVID, I guess it was actually my second year teaching it. It started during COVID, which is an example of a disruption leading to an opportunity for you. The university sent out a request saying, we don't typically do online classes, but we have to do online classes because of COVID. Who would be willing to teach a class with at least 100 students? And other than like oceanography, I think we don't teach many classes with 100 students, certainly not in my world. So I said, okay, this is an opportunity. I'll raise my hand. I'll teach a class with 100 students. I want to call it Leading Business Through Times of Crisis. So I started doing that, and it was going pretty well. And as luck would have it, as fate would have it, a colleague of mine now, who is the former CEO of Sotheby's, the company Sotheby's, the auction company, who happened to be on the board of Lehman Brothers when the business collapsed, which is an interesting place to be at that time, had a chance to speak at a class up at Brown University about managing adversity. So he was a Vanderbilt grad from the 60s. He came back to the chancellor here at Vanderbilt, and he said, I talked at this class at Brown. I think we need to have one of these here at Vanderbilt. And was handed down to me to take over, and I started teaching it with him. And as I looked at the list of guests he wanted to bring into the room, he was bringing in all these people that he's known over the years. So you had one of our classes is Doug Parker, who is the CEO of American Airlines, sitting in the room with Sarah Nelson, who is the president of the Flight Attendants Association. The two of them together, labor and management, talking about dealing with COVID. Or we had, some of you might know in town here, like John Ingram, or recently we had Ken Nattori, who's the president of Nattori Company, and William Dillard, as in Dillard's, came in and talked to the students. But one of the people on the list, when I first got the list of class speakers, was James Patterson. And it had his email and his phone number. And my job was to make sure that when this alum comes back to run this new class, that it has a degree of academic rigor to it, and it fits in the structure of the university. That was my job. So I had to call each person on the list and basically say, how can I best help you in the classroom for this session? And some of them were pretty much like, Patrick, I don't need you at all. Just sit over there and I'll do my thing. And others were, would you interview me? Could we write a case ahead of time? There were lots of different permeations of how we went about doing this. And when I got to James Patterson's name, I called him up on his phone, and the conversation started out a little curt. A little short with me as he was talking to me, and basically insinuated that, you're a college professor, what do you know about like the real world? Which is fair enough, I guess. And I just said, well, I did some other things before I started at the university. He's like, what? I'm like, well, I was an airborne ranger for a while, and then I ran a business for a little while. And then immediately he said, have you read my book about Somalia? About basically the Black Hawk Down situation. And I said, no, I had. He said, well, you need to check that out. And I guess that was a barrier enough that I could get over with him to begin a bit of rapport, which is really critical in any type of relationship-wise. You need to figure out some connection that you can have. Fortunately for us, we're in a house here. We immediately have a quick connection and a recognition of what we all bring to the table. But sometimes that needs to happen through conversation. That's what happened with him. So he came and did the class, and it went well. His opening line, by the way, it was pretty good. It was deadpan, and he says to the class, hi, I'm Stephen King, which is a great opening, right? So after that was over, I was kind of riding a little bit of a high. I'm like, hey, I did this with this guy. It went well. I do a weekly podcast. Maybe he'll do my podcast. So I wrote him a note and asked him to do my podcast, and sure enough, he did it. And after the podcast was over, we spent another 20 minutes or so just chatting on the phone about things, and he shared with me that he enjoyed that longer form conversation like you could have in a podcast, because he usually gets 2 minutes on Good Morning America to talk about the latest book he put out that week, because he literally puts one out almost every week. And he enjoyed it. So then I thought, okay, I've written a few things over the years. I like to write business books. He's never written a business book before. What he talked about was very interesting in class. I could maybe write a book with him, as you would think as well. So I wrote him a note explaining the book I wanted to write with him based upon what I heard him talk about in class and how we could build on it. And I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to partner. And I sent it off to him with very high expectations, and I heard nothing, which is the life of doing certain things, like writing. So then I kind of regrouped myself after 10 days or so. I said, all right, that one didn't work, but I've got to take another shot at this, because I think it's important that we shoot our shots in life. So at this time, I started not just appealing to the, hey, you liked me, I like you type of thing. I started trying to appeal to what I thought would really matter to him. And there's certain things that I thought might matter to him, and you could probably come up with a list, and if we compared them, there'd probably be some similarities and maybe a few things you had thought more creatively than I did. But at the time, I thought, he's never published in this genre before, but he's published in many genres. So this might be of interest to get into a new genre. I realized at the time the fastest book to 1 million copies in my space is James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, and it got to 1 million copies in almost 2 years. I felt James Patterson could beat that number. Maybe I'm appealing to ego, I don't know. I happened to work at a company called Franklin Covey, started back in 2001, and worked with them for a very short period of time before we started our first business, and they were kind enough to say to us, how about we be your second client? So for the next 12 years, we did a lot of work for Franklin Covey. I did a lot of speaking for Franklin Covey. I did some writing for them. And when we sold our business, I actually went back to Franklin Covey for a couple of years and ran their partnerships before I joined the university full-time. So I was able to tell Jim Patterson about my experience having worked with Stephen Covey years ago, and even since his passing. If you're familiar with the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which you referenced the other day from the pulpit, which was amazing. So 7 Habits of Highly Effective People's 40 plus years since it was published. It came out in 1989, and that book still sells 10,000 copies a week. Yeah, 10,000 copies a week. And Stephen passed away 9 or 10 years ago. It's pretty amazing. But they built a business predominantly around that particular book and the training and other development content they created from there that has a market cap of about $500 million and generates about $300 million a year. So it's a pretty sizable training and development company. So you better believe me when I say that I wrote in that note to Jim, hey, I know what can happen if you write a business book that does really well. So cobble all that together, send it off to him. I get a call from his admin, her name's Mary, and Mary said, he'll give you 15 minutes. And we scheduled the 15 minutes for a day in July, a Thursday in July, about 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago now, on a particular Thursday at 9 a.m. our time. The week prior to that, I'm in Colorado with our son, Clay, who's up here, who's very creative, by the way, he makes films. We were up in Colorado. We were driving from Denver down to New Mexico to hike, what's the high point in New Mexico? Wheeler, yeah, Wheeler. This guy's a real hiker. So we're gonna hike Wheeler, and I'm driving down the road, and my phone rings, and I look down, and it's like 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, the week before. And I look down, and it says James Patterson. And I show it to Clay, and he's like, you better answer it. So I'm like, the whole time in my mind, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I had the wrong day. It's this week, not next week. What am I going to do? And all right. So I said, hi, this is Patrick. He said, Patrick, this is Jim. And I remember I looked at my son, I go, hi, Jim, how are you? Because we're, so close at that particular point. So he says, I see on my calendar that I'm supposed to talk to you next week. I said, yeah, next week. I'm looking forward to it. He said, well, we don't need to talk next week. Let's just write the book together. Well, the roller coaster's not over yet. We just made the first lap around the track. So I said, great. What does that mean, let's write the book together? And he said, well, you write up an outline, send it over to me. I'll go through it. I'll give you some feedback. I said, when do you need the outline? He said, 2 weeks to 2 months, which I've learned is his typical response, 2 weeks to 2 months. I said, okay, what if you hate what I send you? And he said, well, we're collaborating. We'll work through it. And I shot up that mountain once we got to New Mexico. I was feeling pretty good. Got down to New Mexico, climbed that mountain, came back to Colorado, climbed another mountain, followed Jess up the mountain on that one. But we got up, I felt pretty good. The next week, the next couple weeks, I did nothing but work on this outline. And I was trying to think about what would a book look like about this that James Patterson would write. So I worked on this outline to the point where it was a 38-page outline. So it was a pretty detailed outline. And one of the things that motivated me to make it longer and longer is because I remember watching an interview where he said that he was writing his first book, which was called Along Came a Spider, and he wrote a 300-page outline for that book and realized, I've written the book. So I'm thinking, this guy likes long outlines. So I send the 38-page outline to him on a Thursday. Monday, he calls me up and begins to tell me in very concise ways everything that he hates about what I wrote and the fact that no one wants to hear my stories. And he wants me to he said, this should feel like a book. It's about disruption. It should feel like no other book out there. You should pick it up and just be completely different. I said, okay. I said, so I should go back and work on this. He's like, no, blow that up. It's terrible. Start all over. I got to go. I got to call Bill Clinton. Click. And right before he hung up, he said, get me something in 2 weeks or 2 months. So at this point, I'm thinking, okay, I was in the game. Now I'm probably out of the game. I'm not exactly sure what's happening. I kind of stared at my shoes for an hour thinking about this because, what does it mean to make a book that feels like no other book? Is it like choose your adventure? Is it read it from the back to the front? Is it all written, wrapped around the page? I mean, what does this even look like? How am I going to survive this thing? And eventually I kind of came back to life and started to move about again. And I didn't let this thing go for 2 months. For the next 2 months, I was just working on this thing. I had decided, he said 2 weeks, 2 months the first time. I got it to him in 2 weeks. He hated it. This time, I'm going to take the entire 2 months because if nothing else, he won't think that I'm just too quick off the draw. So I spent 2 months working on this thing. And I wrote the darkest outline you could imagine for anything in the leadership or self-help type of space. It was basically like, thanks for picking this book up. It's going to do you no good. You're not going to go anywhere with this. If you look around the shelves around you, they're all selling you a story. I mean, it was awful. It was an awfully dark book, but it was like nothing else on the shelf. So I sent this to him on a Thursday. He calls me on a Monday. He says to me, you can't write. Now, think about this. If your desire in life is to do some writing and the world's best-selling author tells you can't write, that's not a good thing necessarily. And then we kind of unpack it for a few moments. I'm like, taking the shots. And I said, okay, so where do we go from here? And then he says, well, sometimes, Patrick, you want to do a project with somebody, but then you realize it's just not going to work. Oof. Right? We've all had those moments. But I'm like, okay. Then we're talking a little longer. He says, well, maybe I'll give you a blurb or an endorsement for the book. I was like, all right, I'm back in it. Right? If I get an endorsement from him, I'll take that. We'll move along. But then as we talked a little bit longer, he said, well, maybe I'll put my name on it. And then by the time we were done, he said, write it on spec and send it to me. Now I'm kind of falling out of the collaborator space, and I'm kind of in the write a book and send it to him, maybe he'll take it space. But I'm kind of still in the game. So I said, okay. So the next few months, I fiddled around with it, and I started to write the book that I wanted to write, not the one I thought he wanted me to write, which is obviously a lesson I should have learned a long time ago, and you could tell where that would go. It's much better if you write the one you want to write. So I started working more on the book I wanted to write, and I realized to really pull this thing off, I needed some help. And I went to the chancellor of our university, Daniel Diermeyer. And I know him because he speaks in one of my classes, so I have a bit of a rapport with him, but I don't know him that well. Right? I could say hello to him, and he might 50-50 shot he's going to get my name. I mean, just the reality of it. So I make an appointment with him, and my thinking on it at the time was, Patterson went to Vanderbilt. There would probably be a win for the university if Patterson and one of the professors write a book together. So I went to the chancellor, and I know I'm in the house of the Lord. I made a few things up on the fly, put it that way. I said to him, Chancellor Diermeyer, I have a 15% chance of writing a book with arguably one of our most successful people in their own domain from Vanderbilt University, James Patterson. The 15% is the made up part. I just made that number up. But if you give me what I want, it immediately goes to 50%. And if I do what I'm supposed to do every month for the next period of time, it'll go up 3 or 4% every month. So by the time next December comes along, which was this past December, I think I got an 80% chance this book is going to happen. He said, what do you want? And I said, I want a research team to help me do this. And I want some funding for some travel to interview some people. And he gave it to me. So fast forward over the next few months, put the team together, put a new outline in front of Patterson last April. He said, this is it. I see what it is, what you're trying to do now. You need to interview some really great people. I said, who do you got? He gave me a list of a few people, introduced me to them. We got the ball rolling, made a couple trips over the course of last summer, did more interviews. December we met in person. He really likes where this thing's going. He approved the first 7 chapters. And we're on track to relaunch this book next year. And it's called Disrupt Everything. And the idea behind the book is that there's a hard thing we all have to do in life. And that hard thing in life is to define what a good life is for you. Now, we can make an argument that it's already been determined for us. We have to explore and figure this out. But we have to do the hard work, regardless of how we go about doing this, of thinking about our purpose, of thinking about what are we really talented at? What are the gifts that we have that we're not just okay at, but we really stand out with these things? And what is our conscience telling us about the needs of the world and how we could fill some of those needs? And what are we passionate about? What are the things we will do in life if no one pays us to do them? And what are our values? What do we stand for and what will we not stand for? And what types of relationships do we want to have in our lives? Which ones matter to us and what do we want people to say and think about us? All of these things are hard to do to varying degrees. But that's just the first step. The other step is once you define what that good life looks for you or what you believe your purpose is in life, the second part is you have to live that thing out. And in business, we would say it's much easier to define a strategy than it is to execute the strategy. And the same thing is probably true, I would say, in our lives. It's easier to sit down and write down what we want to be, which is easier to do than go out and live that life. I don't know about all of you, but that Sunday refresher sometimes is really helpful for me to stay on track, because by Friday night, I start to wane sometimes. So that was what we got into in the challenge of this. And I wrote about this idea that for us to really live out the life we really want to live out, or we believe we're here to live out, we need to get clear on 3 truths that exist. The first truth is that the status quo is a deceptive little devil. If you like things just the way they are right now, they're not going to stay the way they are right now. We might get a diagnosis. We might get a promotion. We might get a new opportunity. There's lots of things that'll change in small ways and big ways, but they're going to change. The second thing is that not only will change happen, but you're wired to deal with that change. You're wired in how God created our minds. Our prefrontal cortex is amazing. We have the ability to do things that no other creature on this planet can do in regard to envision a different future and then begin to manifest it. That's unique to us. But we're also wired in our experiences. Our lives, my life, your life, everyone's life is full of ups and downs, lessons learned. And if you were to chart those out, some of the lowest points end up being some of the greatest lessons in our lives. So we're wired through our own experience to know how to handle things when they unfold. And we're also wired in our relationships. In our case, we would say our relationship with God, our relationship with our families, our relationship with other people who matter to us, but we're wired through our relationships. So that's the second truth. You're wired to handle disruptions. And then the third truth is you only have one life here on this planet. What are you going to do with it? So based upon that, we kind of launch into this argument in the book about how disruption typically unfolds in your life. And specifically, we're not encouraging you to just be disruptive for the purpose of being disruptive. We're talking about being a positive disruptor. So we've all seen negative disruptors. Somebody can be a curmudgeon at work or in the meeting or just be difficult to be difficult. We're talking about positive disruptors where you're living from that place of your purpose and your values and your relationships, and you're looking to make a bigger impact as you move closer to your version of your good life, your purpose, and hopefully help others to do the same. So what we say is disruptions happen. They happen in all sorts of ways. They're unique and they're ubiquitous. Unique would be your boss says, we need to talk about your job. Ubiquitous would say, we only have 2 weeks to bend the curve. Y'all heard about that, right? COVID happened? Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, so that's ubiquitous. It could be small, it could be big. It's all different things are disruptive. And when disruptions happen, they have the chance to start to rewire our thinking. So we talk about how a disruptive moment can cause us to think about what the opportunities are or what the challenges might be and how we can use that opportunity to discern what we can do. Use that brain that we have. Then from there, we talk about the idea of that discernment when you make a decision about what you might want to do based upon this disruption or what opportunity comes from it, you then have to think about your behaviors. What are you going to do differently? And we studied, so far I've interviewed about 150 disruptors. Some are household names, like Damon Wayans, the actor, was one that I interviewed. Our own Keith Getty, I interviewed Keith Getty. Traveled around and interviewed a lot of folks, the founders of companies like Warby Parker and other people like that. And then a lot of unsung heroes, people that you would never have heard of before who have done some amazing, inspiring things. And we try to gather their stories, and along the way we started to get clear on what are the behaviors of positive disruptors. And we can explore that more later on. And then we got into the results from doing this, and then ultimately how you can refine and improve. So that's the project I'm working on right now. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that, or if you want to go further into any other area, I'm happy to do that, Kim. Oh, tell the car wash story. Yeah, so somebody I interviewed back in December really impacted. So my last book that I put out came out from HarperCollins, and I was reaching out to them asking about people that it might be worth interviewing. He was trying to use your network to figure out who are good folks to interview. And they told me about a book they had recently came out, and I looked at it. I said, that sounds interesting. And I went down to the southern part of Florida, South Florida, and I interviewed this guy in a car wash. And the car wash was called Rising Tides Car Wash. And I went in and just sat down, we just chatted for a while, and he told me a story. When he was 22 years old, he was graduating college, kind of the whole life before him type of thing. He had visions of grandeur, that he was going to work on Wall Street in the business and finance world. That's what he saw for himself. But in the process of going through interviews, he had a bit of downtime to do other things and kind of explore and check out other aspects of his life. And one thing he decided to do is go spend a week with his brother. His brother at the time was 20. So the 22-year-old went back to school with his brother for a week. His brother is on the autism spectrum. And what he was concerned about was that what's going to happen? I'm going to have this great career, but what's my brother's life going to be like? Because he's starting to age out of the school system that's available to him. So after the course of spending a week in his brother's school and kind of seeing like what types of tasks he could do or what type of ways he could find meaning through work in his own life, he started to realize, I don't need to go work on Wall Street. I need to do something to help my brother. He takes the brother's keeper thing very seriously. And over the course of time, he opened up a car wash, and his brother started working there. And they started hiring more people on the autism spectrum. Now they have 3 car washes in South Florida. They are 5 times more productive than their competitors. They're absolutely more profitable than their competitors. Their retention rates are incredible as far as people continue to come back to work. They're very engaged in their work. But he told me it wasn't an easy journey. There were times when he was going through that where he wanted to quit. want to stop doing this. He said, can you imagine I'm sitting in the office here and the workers are out, doing their various jobs, and somebody pulls up to the car wash department, you bring in their car, and they may have no idea about the noble cause of our car wash. And even if they know a little bit about it, the bottom line is they're paying money and they want their car cleaned, right? And if you've ever driven up to those car washes where you have to get the car lined up the right way and then put it in neutral, and I've been driving a long time and I still get a little bit nervous in that moment. And if I'm getting a little bit nervous and anxious in that moment, and the person who's guiding me is getting a little bit nervous while I'm getting a little nervous, and then I raise my voice at that person, and then they react in a way I wouldn't necessarily think they would react, and then their coworkers start to react in ways I wouldn't think, it can get kind of challenging, right, and quickly. And he said, that's what my life was like. He's like, every day I'm just trying to calm everybody down and keep things moving, and he goes, I just try to get through the day and put my head on the pillow at the end of the day. He goes, but then I thought about it this way. He said, okay, so let's say I close the car wash down. This isn't going to work. I still need to help my brother. That purpose hasn't changed. So what do? You open a deli and he helps me make sandwiches, and then a customer comes in and they get frustrated with how he's making a sandwich, and then my brother gets upset, and then the coworkers get upset, and then I'm right back where I started from. And he said that was actually very liberating for him to kind of think through that. And over the course of time of thinking through that, he went from how do I put my head on the end of the pillow at the end of the day and survive today to, all right, what are they going to do tomorrow? What's going to happen tomorrow, and how can I address this? And right as we were wrapping up our conversations, you might imagine, I was like, this is an incredible story. I can't wait to share it with the world. As we were finishing up, I started to walk away, and then I looked back at him. He was sitting there. He was wearing a red polo shirt, sitting in this office. I'd never gotten the chance to go this deep into a car wash before. I had always been limited to the area next to it with the pour coffee. This is the room adjacent to it. This is where all the vending machine snacks are piled up and where all the paperwork sits at. And there's like more furniture and desk chairs than could possibly fit in that room are all shoved in there. And he's sitting there, and I look back at him, and I just said, I have one more question for you. What would your 35-year-old self say if he walked in here and he saw you? What would your 22-year-old self say if he walked in here right now and saw you at 35 years old sitting in this car wash? And he said he would tell me, you're in the exact right place. And to me, that's a really powerful story of someone who had a moment of disruption in his life where he was going one particular direction. He visited his brother's school, and he said, wait a minute. If I want to fulfill the life that I believe I need to fulfill in order to become the person that I believe I'm compelled to be, I need to be a good steward of this relationship, which means I may have to set some other things aside and choose a different path for myself. So it's that type of story that we're kind of capturing in here. And it's everything from people quitting jobs in one city and moving to another city and falling into all sorts of hard times, and fast forward 6 months later and they're feeding 1 million people. Or a lady who I really found, my wife, Jamie, spent a year in Denmark as an exchange student, and we've become very close to a Danish family over there. We go try to visit them almost every year. And while we were over there, most recently, Christina, Jamie's Danish sister, said, you need to talk to this lady named Pia Lindell Quist. And we said, okay. So I talked to Pia. And Pia's story was that she's from Copenhagen, and she was down in India. She was in India with some girlfriends on a trip, on a vacation, and they were traveling from one area to another. They were going through Calcutta, and she was in the back of a taxi cab with a driver, and she pulled over. She said, okay, I admit it. I pulled over to smoke a cigarette. No judging right now, please. I said, okay, keep going. She said, I pulled over to smoke a cigarette. I got out of the car. And these 2 little children, she said probably 3 and 5 years old, came up to me and started asking me for money, for help. She goes, what stood out to me as I looked at them is there was nothing in their eyes. They were vacant, as she described it. It was just disruptive. She gets back in the car and she says to the driver, who are those children? And in a very dismissive tone, the driver said, they're street children, don't worry about them. And she said, what do you mean, don't worry about them? He said, well, they live on the streets. She said, what do people do to them? He said, people do whatever they want to those children. I say that again. They do whatever they want to God's children. So she said, take me where they live at. And he said, I'm not going to take you where they live. And she said, you work for me right now. Take me where they live. So he took her to where they lived, and there was underneath that overpass first, and they kind of scattered about. She said the grime is what stuck with her when she saw these kids. Then went to a train station, similar type of situation. Flying back to Denmark. If you've ever been to Denmark, it's not like that in Denmark. If you ever had a Lego set, that's what Denmark looks like. Everything lines up nicely and fits all together so well. She was flying back to Denmark, and she said to her, she couldn't get out of her mind. The disruption changed her thinking. She goes back to Copenhagen, where she had just spent every penny she had to open her own restaurant, because she'd been a server in a restaurant for a long time, and her goal was to open up her own restaurant. Now she's got her new restaurant open, and every person that comes in the door, she's trying to tell them about the kids in India. And her friends are telling her, like, Pia, chill out, take it easy. But she couldn't get out of her mind. Shortly thereafter, she found herself in the hospital for a procedure, probably somewhat connected to the stress of opening a business, I would imagine, and stressing about kids in India. But she ended up having a medical procedure, and was in the recovery room. And there was an older woman in the recovery room, in the bed adjacent to her, and Pia started telling her about the children in India. And she said, here's how my friends are reacting to it. They're telling me stop talking about it, move on with life, etc., but I can't get them out of their mind. And this older woman said, pay them no attention. Do what you believe you need to do. So for the next 2 years, Pia would take every dollar she could save up and go to India. And she started to go back to those same places. And she said, I would take no more with me when I walked out there than I could afford to have someone steal from me, because they always stole my purse. They always stole my wallet. They would take things from me, but I didn't care. And eventually, she came back on a trip, and somebody came back and handed her a wallet that had been taken during her previous trip. And they started calling her Auntie. And they started interacting with her, and she asked them what their hopes and dreams were, and they told her, we'd like a roof over our head and some schooling or a future and someone to love us. That seems reasonable. Now, right there, you could say, well, look at that. That's that whole disruptive cycle, right? She had a disruption. It changed her thinking. It changed her behavior. She got these different results. She achieved different things. But the last step in that process is refinement, where you revisit your results. What did we do? How did it go? What can we learn from this? What can we do better? How can we recommit? And that's what she did. Fast forward to today, she has 3 orphanages in Calcutta. She takes care of through the nonprofit she created, take care of 700 children a day. It's amazing. It's amazing. They have a facility for women and children. They have it now in a couple other community centers in there. And I have this great picture that she sent me of her kissing a little girl on the street. It's so sweet. And it just so captures the story of someone who chooses in their life to be a positive disruptor. But one thing we talk about in the book is this idea that being a positive disruptor happens at many levels. You can see Pia as this kind of almost to an extreme, if you will, because she's impacting people part way around the world from her, and lots of people in big numbers and lofty goals. But we don't all have to do that. We're not all required to do that in life. We first have to disrupt ourselves, though. We have to choose to do some things differently and to see things differently. That's the first level of disruption. We disrupt ourselves. Then we might choose or have the opportunity to disrupt relationships. And Jim says, I don't want to cause a bunch of divorces with this book. But he does want to cause a bunch of conversations. Relationships that we all know sometimes, that one's not quite great. It could be better. In fact, I had one of those myself years ago. I was in a workshop, doing workshop things where somebody's talking and you're doing little activities, just like I have students do. I was doing one of those. And the activity that day was to draw a circle. I nailed it. It was a really good circle. And then adjacent to the circle, list all the roles that you fulfill in your life. And if you really do that, there's a lot of roles. If you spend some time, you can list off like 20 or 30 roles. You're a friend, you might be a sibling, you're somebody's child, you're somebody's parent perhaps, you're an aunt or an uncle or whatever your job is, or a project leader, all these things, right? All these different things. We all have a long list. Then they said, okay, go back through that and pick no more than 5 or 6 or so that are the most important ones right now. So you go through the list, and that's what I did. And I went through, and I looked at the list, and one of the roles I had written down was son, S-O-N. Son of my parents. And I said, okay, that's one I do right now. I'm going to kind of use that one. as one of the several that I made. And they said, okay, now take that circle, divide it up into slices like you would a pie, and label each slice of the pie one of those rolls that you picked. And then imagine if you're doing a poor job at this one, put a dot kind of toward the outside of the circle. And if you're doing an awesome job, put a dot toward the inside of the circle for each of those rolls. So you can imagine that each piece coming in, there's a dot. It could be all the way in, like you're on target, or all the way out on the edge. So I went through and I did the exercise. And then I just spent a few moments looking at it. And when I looked at it, there were things that I'd like to do better. There were probably some things that I wasn't quite self-aware enough about, but I put a dot somewhere. And the one that I looked at was not that great, was son, S-O-N. I didn't know it at the time, but I was kind of embarking on disrupting a relationship there. So I looked at that and I said, okay, how am I doing as a son? If my parents were to come in here right now, they wouldn't have said something like, oh, he was the most horrific child you can possibly imagine. He made our lives miserable and blah, blah. They wouldn't say that. But they'd be like, yeah, he's a good son. He calls once a week. Probably out of obligation. I would call once a week. They lived in Chicago. At the time, we were living in Louisville, Kentucky. I'd call once a week. We would do the typical, what's the traffic like in Chicago right now? What's the weather like in Chicago right now? My parents would go through the list of activities they had planned for the week. I would check my calendar with them, and we'd call it a good conversation. And I thought, it's got to be better than that. What if I worked on that? What if I just asked them a couple of questions about things that they dealt with in raising 5 children that I'm dealing right now with raising 2 children that might be insightful? And I'll be darned if they didn't know a lot of good things. It kind of surprised me. So I started doing that. And then I would travel for work. I used to go out and do a lot of work on the road. I would travel for work, and I'd drop them a postcard. I'm sure at some point they thought my health was failing, because why was he doing all these things? But then Jamie, my wife Jamie, and son Clay at the time, he's still my son, but at the time he was in 8th grade, and I got a call from one of our clients who it was actually Franklin Covey, asking me if I would help them roll out a new product they were working on. And they sent us a list of 175 cities around the world and said, pick out 30 or so you want to do. It was a pretty good deal. So we picked out these cities, and we ended up going on this long trip. We went out of the country for a few months, and we came back from that trip. And along the way, I dropped my parents a couple cards along the way and doing a better version of son. We come back from that trip, and I land in Louisville. Very shortly thereafter, I get back on a plane. I fly out to go someplace else, and I have a layover in Dallas. And then when the plane lands in Dallas, I turn my phone back on, like all of you do. And there was a text message from one of my brothers. I'm the youngest of 5. My brother texts me and says, call me. I call him. I called him up. I said, what's going on? He said, Mom is feeling worse. She's declining. And my mom had some health problems for a while. She's declining. You need to come home. I said, no problem. It's Wednesday or whatever the day was. I'm going to finish up this trip. I'll be back by Friday. Jamie and I will jump in the car in Louisville. We'll drive back up to Chicago. It's a 7-hour drive. No big deal. And he said, you need to come home now. Fortunately, the plane I just got off of was going right back to Louisville. So I got back on that same plane, flew back to Louisville. Jamie and I got in the car. We drove up to Chicago. Have you ever had those stories you hear where somebody's the last person to show up, or they're waiting for someone to show up? I was that person. So I'm the 5th child. I was the 5th one to show up. Saw my mom. About 2 hours later, she passed away. And I remember thinking at the time, and I didn't have the words for it to say, like, it's a disruption. I disrupted a relationship. But that's what I thought at the time, is I remember thinking, I'm so glad that I did those couple extra things, those little things that, at least in my mind, but I believe in hers too, made a difference. And I remember after her visitation and her funeral, we were back at what is now my dad's house, right? Had always been my mom and dad's place. Back at my dad's place. And it's that awkward experience. You're eating like cold cut sandwiches, and nobody knows quite what to say because you feel like someone's missing because someone's missing. And I said to my wife, I am so glad that I chose to work on being a better son. I'm so glad that I decided to disrupt that relationship. And while I was riding that high for just that very moment, she elbows me and she says, you're still a son. And she pointed at the other guy across the room. Now, I look across the room and there's my father. And not everybody, but many of us have the yes parent and the no parent in our lives. My mom was the yes parent. My dad was the no parent. My mom was the one, if we were going to go to the mall, I know it's going to be a long trip because she's going to go in every store and touch everything. My dad is the one who says, we need a new refrigerator. What's the closest door to refrigerators at Sears? I want to park there, walk in, buy the first refrigerator. I say, see, I don't care if it fits or not. We're bringing it home. So I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm still a son. So I go over to my father and I said, hey, Dad, I travel a lot for work. Do you want to come with me? Fully expecting him to say no. And he says, where are you going? And I'm like, grab my phone. I'm like, I go to Topeka, Kansas next week. He's like, I'll go with you. So then my dad started going on trips with me for work. Not a bunch, but a few. Went to Florida together, went to a couple places together. He saw me kind of in a different light, watching me speak to groups or doing things like that than he saw, as the youngest one at the dinner table every night. That's disrupting relationships. You don't have to go to India to do that. The next level is disrupting your team. Many of you might work on teams in organizations. I mean, life is made up of teams. And whether it's a paid gig or a volunteer role or working even in your family, there's the dynamics of a team going on there, and there's opportunities to disrupt teams. I went to University of Kentucky. The person I interviewed to talk about disrupting teams was John Calipari. He's the coach of University of Kentucky. And if you followed any basketball this week, yeah, that chapter is kind of questionable at the moment, but they got knocked out pretty quick in the tournament this year. But it was an interesting discussion with him, and we sat down. I was told I could have 20 minutes with him, and we ended up talking for an hour and a half because he's very passionate about leadership, and it's very interesting about how he talks about developing a team because every year he gets some of the best players in the world to come play for him. And although he wants to make sure that they all have similar values and worldviews, he doesn't necessarily want to make sure everybody fits perfectly in his system, but he's willing to adapt his system to them. So it's kind of the conversation about teams. And then from there, you can disrupt your organization, and then disrupt your industry, and then disrupt society is kind of the ripples of those.
Patrick, this is all so fascinating, and I just love it. It's interesting because so many of the things you're talking about so parallel the walk of faith and the walk, when we listen for the Holy Spirit to move us in different ways. It's just a different term to think of it as disruptions and responding. It's much like when the Holy Spirit moves us and you think, oh, I'm not going to, well, maybe I'll do that. And then later you look back and go, the Lord had tapped you on the shoulder and you responded. But to think of it in these terms, every time we give it a new form to think of it, it makes it easier to understand in our lives. One of the things I'm curious about is because you are a believer and because so many of these things come out of a life of faith for you, how is that working as you work with Jim? I mean,
yeah.
that other Jim.
Actually, we both can talk about the struggles of working with Jims, right?
Yes. We both have experiences. Jim experiences.
Well, like many folks, I'm out in the world,
right.
if you will, trying to live by faith, and I write secular books.
Yes.
But there's certain ways you can do things. For example, my last book, the 5-week leadership challenge book, the subtitle to that book is 35 Action Steps to Become the Leader You Were Meant to Be. And that's a very subtle way in my mind of saying not like the leader you want to be or the leader you look inwardly and decide you're going to be. It's the leader you were designed to be, the leader you were meant to be. And the structure of that particular book, if you pick it up, it's 35 stories. And each story has the story and then reflection questions and then a little challenge. And I'll be darned if it doesn't look a lot like a devotional. In fact, if somebody wanted to spend some energy, they could pull the scripture references and figure those out pretty quickly. Yeah. So from that perspective, there's some subtle things that you can do. But then there's some other things I think I have an obligation to do, I want to do. So, I mentioned like this interviewing Keith Getty for this book. I think that's an important thing to do. And there's a couple other Christian people that I'm writing about. Christian people, those people. No, people who have faith that I'm writing about because I think it's an opportunity to infuse their narrative and their story into something that hopefully many, many people will read. And not that they don't have many people paying attention to them already, but if I can add one, That's
Well,
a great
and
thing.
because the audience for the sale of this book, because of James's name, is going to reach a broad audience
it'll
that
be
may not
yeah.
know them, and that's what I was fascinated that James bought into that.
Yeah. He has, it's still in the book. It made it through the cut. So yeah.
I love the
And
process.
if not, you figure other ways to put things in, but we'll see.
Well, and what you described at the very beginning is like a telos, a purpose. You've got to find what gives life meaning, is what you were talking about. And that is very much about how God designed us, and that we all have a telos, a goal, a meaning for life. Okay, I have a couple of questions. And if you have questions, I'll give you a few minutes to throw those out. And then I have a handout from Patrick that I think will be really fun for you to have. Okay, let me see. How do we identify opportunities to improve our thoughts, actions, and results when we navigate disruptions? So that's a little bit more personal.
Yeah. So how do we figure out ways to, we say, improve our thoughts, actions, and results? Yeah. So it's hard to do sometimes in the throes of it. It's hard in that moment, unless you have a lot of muscle memory of doing something a certain way, or habit, as we would say. You don't necessarily know when you feel out of sync from that habit. Is oftentimes in retrospect where you realize, this could have been done differently. So I would say it this way. So I mentioned Doug Parker from American Airlines spoke in one of my classes a couple of times, and he has a great expression that I liked. He said, a crisis, because it's a crisis class, is not the time to start making introductions. And what he meant by that is you better know some people you're going to have to work with long before this problem comes along, and have those relationships built so you can draw from the deep well of those relationships. And I think about it in a similar way in regards to when you're trying to fix your behavior in the moment, is almost like you're trying to make an introduction to yourself in that moment.
Yeah, it might be a little late.
Because you're in it. Yeah, it's a little late. So I think that but I also believe that we learn from everything, good, bad, right, wrong, indifferent. We learn from those situations. So my point is that I think a lot of the changing of our behavior comes after we reflect on something, and we have the self-awareness to say, okay, what can I learn from that? So one way to think about it is if your thinking drives your behavior and your behavior drives your results. If I don't like my results, I need to look at my behavior that's driving those, and look at my mindset that's causing me to take on those behaviors. And maybe I'm just not seeing things the right way.
And then in that reflection, it's not like it's the first time you've ever had a disruption.
Sure.
How did I handle it last time, and what worked and what didn't? Prepares us for that next disruption, maybe.
No, absolutely, yeah. We talk about refining. We talk about the idea of refining your approaches. You're reviewing your results. You're reflecting on those and kind of interpreting those. You're revising perhaps your approach to something, and then you're recommitting to something new, or you're rewiring your mind, because our mind does have the ability to rewire.
Yeah.
I'm big on those. I used to be in the Army. I'm big on acronyms, and
makes it easier to remember.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a couple more. How can we be a catalyst for positive change and impact, not only for ourselves, but for those around us when disruptions happen? How can we be a good infection?
Yeah. So I think the best way to think about it, at least how we're thinking about it right now, is in the book right now, we're working on 16 behaviors of positive disruptors. And in keeping with trying to have easy models to remember, I call it the anatomy of a positive disruptor. And the idea is you can kind of think from head to toe, right? So for every body part that I'll point to, there's 2 behaviors. So we found these, we initially kind of posit, this is what we think the behaviors are, and then you go out and talk to people and you refine them and you address them, you change them around. And I'm not saying you have to have all 16 of these behaviors to do it exceptionally well. I'm not even suggesting that there's a scale where you have to get 9 or 10 and then it offsets and this one's worth more. I'm just saying there's these 16 things that we consistently show up in the behaviors of these positive disruptors, and it's probably worth reflecting on these to see if there's an opportunity for all of us to get better, myself at the front of that line. So the first one, brains, this is kind of where we start at the top, is the idea that the positive disruptors we've worked with and interviewed so far think deeply about things in order to gain insights. So let's think about that one for just a moment, if you will. So they think deeply about things. They're actually conscious of what's going on around them, and they're thinking deeply about things in order to gain the insight. What is that telling me? So an insight, I would argue, means that something is, if it's insightful, it means it's rare. Most people don't know about this thing. And second of all, it's valuable. So if I'm the only one that knows about something, but nobody else in the world cares about it, that's not particularly an insight. But if I know about something because I've invested the time, the intellectual capital to figure this thing out, and it's valuable, that's insightful. So that's one of them. My other behavior to think about around the brain is they also believe that things can get better. And that one came up over and over again. I was talking to this lady named Josie Nattori. And some people may be familiar, maybe more ladies than gentlemen. But Josie Nattori has a line of lingerie and pajamas and undergarments that are sold at like Nordstrom and Saks Fifth Avenue and Bloomingdale's and kind of a lot of the higher end retail stores. And when I talked to her, she's around 80 years old. She started that business. She was actually she was an immigrant from the Philippines. She came here for schooling. She ended up being the first female vice president of investment banking on Wall Street in 1976. Wow. But she had such a drive to start her own business. She was very unfulfilled. You talk about meaning and purpose. She was like, this is not what I want to do. And she initially started out saying, maybe I'll open a car wash. 2 car wash stories, go figure. The night's over. So 2 car wash stories. But she thought about car wash and like counting how many cars go through a car wash in Manhattan or in Queens. And she thought about a McDonald's and all these type of things. But in the end, she took a peasant blouse from the Philippines into a Bloomingdale's and got a buyer at the Bloomingdale's to say, I'll buy that from you if you make some changes to it. Fast forward now, it's 40 some years later. She has a manufacturing facility with about 400 employees in the Philippines. She has a business that generates a few $100 million a year, top line in this clothing. She's still in Nordstrom. She's still in Saks Fifth Avenue. She's still in all these stores. She travels once a month back to the Philippines. That's a long trip. Back to the Philippines to check on the plant and to check on her 100-year-old mother who does payroll. And every year Josie's designing the new line of clothing. Wow. And I said to her, where does the drive, why are you still doing this? Like, what, you don't want to say, well, you're almost 80, what's going on? But you're kind of like, what's going on? And she said, it can always get better. It can always get better. But I will say this before I go through the rest, I'll probably spend the rest of the time talking about these body parts. But I will say this, the idea behind this, remember I said in the very beginning, when you're thinking about it, it's about discernment. It's about deciding what should I do in the face of this disruption. And discernment will tell us that it's not always about raising the bar and tackling something again and again and again. This is not that type of disruption. Like, oh, well, if 10 was good, 11's better. If 11's good, 12's better. 12's good, 13's better. Because there is a limit to those things. What we talk about in discernment is the idea of thinking, when the disruption occurs, the ability to reflect on it and think about it from 2 perspectives. One is, in this moment, am I striving more? Do I feel compelled to strive more toward change, right, or more towards stability? And the second thing is, and do I feel like I should move out on my own, or should I move out with others? And each of those areas matter. So we use a lot of fire analogies in the book. So if you move out on your own toward change, we call that person is a trailblazer. So that's somebody who's leading out on their own. If I'm leading out for change, but I'm doing it through a team or through other people, that's a torchbearer. If I decide that, now is not the right time for this change, we've already had 3 computer systems. That one sounds interesting, but not right now. And I'm just going to stop it myself as the leader. We call that a firefighter. And then there's the fourth area is the idea that sometimes now is not necessarily the right time. I need to help my team or others come to that decision. I need to gather some more information, whatever, we call that a Tinder gatherer, the idea. So those are the different, okay, so that's the brain. Okay. Then we're going to, I got through one body part. One body part.
We got the brain.
2, I'll go quicker. 2, eyes. Eyes, you both have to be able to cast a vision. And then you have to do the other part, which is you also have to look closely at the brutal reality of where you're at. And both of those things matter because there's some people that I'm a big picture thinker. I'm a strategic thinker. I don't worry about the details. Well, the details will kind of catch up on you, right? Reality catches up on you. So I have to be able to cast a vision, but I also need to be reality of where I'm at right now and recognize how big that gap is. The third one is ears. They need to be able to listen with the intent to understand, and that was certainly something Stephen Covey taught me pretty well. But the idea is that we listen at varying levels. But here we're talking about the idea of I want to understand the other person's perspective. I want to have empathy for them. I want to be able to communicate it to them in a way where they say, you got it. As opposed to what we all do sometimes, right? We pretend listen, we ignore. I know that I'm pretend listening when my wife is telling me something and I'm just nodding my head and she says, what are you saying? And I'm like, I don't know, but you're beautiful, right? I'm caught. Okay. Then you go down to mouth, and mouth is that positive disruptors say smart things. They say smart things. Sounds simple, but sometimes we don't do it very well, right? I like it when somebody says, that's a really good question. It means I actually said something that caused them to stop for a moment. Right. Unless I'm just doing it for myself, for them to say it to me, then it's not good. All right, but say smart things. And the second thing is that with that is once they find the message that matters, they stay on that message, which is really hard, especially for people who enjoy writing or doing things. Is you don't want to talk about the last book, you want to talk about the next book. You don't want to talk about, right? But you got to stay on that message, okay? Then we come down to heart. And people who are positive disruptors, they yearn to address needs or problems that they see in the world. They see pain that other people have, and they yearn to do something about it. But the second thing is they're actually willing to reach out and do something about it, is the other behavior. So it's very easy, and I fall into this trap. I'm human like the rest of us, where I might see something and go, oh, that's awful. On with my life, right? As opposed to that's awful, and I'm Pia, and I'm going to get back on that airplane, right? Then we go down to stomach, guts. And the idea of guts is that they trust their gut if they have a gut worth trusting. And I was talking about this down in, there's a pretty good gig. I got a call to go to the Bahamas earlier this year in January. That was a pretty good one. And they had a big casino there. And I remember I was talking to like 200 leaders in the room, and I said, do you think that everybody has a gut worth trusting? And like a lot of hands went up in the room. I'm like, seriously? Like, go to that casino floor at 10 o'clock tonight and tell me if everybody has. But the reality is, there's some things we have good instincts on. Right. There's some things we have great experience from. And there's other things where it's like, I could give you good advice in this area, but this year I'm way out of my league. I better find somebody. So we need to either have a gut that's worth trusting or surround us by ourselves with others who do. And that's okay. That means you have a good team. Because a good team, your strengths make up for my weaknesses. And then the other part of guts is you're able to calm the butterflies when you're in the midst of trying this new thing or going over to my father and having this conversation type of thing. Then the next one's hands. I need to be able to let go of something in order to grab something else, even if what I have is good. I need to let go of it to get something beautiful. And I also need to be willing to roll my sleeves up and get my hands dirty. And that comes in many shapes or forms, but just to get involved in something.
Are these in the book?
Yeah.
These are great.
And then the last one is feet. Thank you. Yeah, pre-order. And the last one is feet.
And I meant that.
And the last one is feet. And the two things with feet are, one is you're willing to run toward change. Not every change, but you're willing to do it, not as opposed to running away from everything. And secondly is you're willing to stand firm in the face of doubters. Do you see some alignment between some of these and things we talk about around here? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. So many
There's nothing new under the sun, so I've been told.
Well, and you speak out of the things, as a believer, those things come through no matter what. I have some questions, but because we have a few more minutes, I want to give you guys an opportunity if you have some questions. So right here.
Yes, sir.
Enjoyed your talk very much. Thank you. Picking up on the faith issue that Kim raised earlier, I think for me, and maybe most of us, the biggest disruption in my life is when Christ came in.
Yes.
And it changed my whole life. And before I was probably thinking, I want to do this. This is me. Covey does this in his book, I think. 7 Habits. Here you are. Here's what you want to do. You go toward that. And my life was totally changed. And it's not my will, but your will, and so on. And I wondered how much faith enters. A lot of the people you talked about, like the man with the car wash and something, if you could see that God could have been in that. He probably was in that. And I don't know if he was a Christian or knew the Lord or whatever. But that's a wonderful way that God transforms us and guides us. And I was wondering that tension between self-actualization, which is in a lot of that leadership literature, and being a Christian and dying to yourself and living for Christ. How does that?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Michael. I would say that in every conversation I've had, and I've had a lot of them in these interviews, that's particularly if, faith tradition didn't come up or what your beliefs didn't come up typically, but occasionally they did. And other times they weren't said directly, but you could pick up on it, just in the way they were going about saying certain things. So I would certainly say that there were many people I talked to that their faith played a sizable role, to the point where they talk about things in ways where they were literally born anew, right? Something happened and they were born anew in this particular thing. They felt a drive to do something different. The one lady I talked to was on a Christian mission trip to Africa, to Sierra Leone. And she was in college at the time. She came back from this trip and she was both torn between the feeling of euphoria that she did something really good on a mission trip and she felt like she was, doing what the Lord wanted her to do, and the feeling that there was so much more to do. And she remembered sitting around with some of the other kids who went on this trip with them, and there was a lot of patting on the back with each other about, didn't we do a great thing, and maybe we'll do it again in 3 years. And I'm not trying to say that's not a good thing to do. I'm just saying from her perspective, she was like 3 years, but the needs are so big. And she has a group called All Across Africa now. And she has 8,000 artisans that sell into Costco and Target and a whole bunch of places that make baskets and things all over Africa. That was a very overt conversation about her faith. There were other ones that, no, not at all. It was very much like, I wanted a big house, or I wanted whatever. There's part of me that says, well, that's a treadmill. And at some point you might want to turn that treadmill off or take Zillow off your phone, because there's always a bigger house. But as far as making a judgment call at that moment, I was kind of sticking to I'll make an assumption at this moment. It is a positive disruption if you're moving out with what you believe your purpose is. And that's where I kind of drew a line for our discussions here. But I definitely saw people whose lives were inverted through all this.
And I'm so grateful that you're in the sphere that you're in, because Christians need to be in every aspect of the arts. We don't all need to be writing just Christian books, but secular books. In all of the arts, we need to be everywhere. And I'm just so grateful that you have a platform where you do, and that you're who you are, where you are. Mel?
Hi, Patrick. Mel Smith.
Hi.
As I'm listening to you, the idea of disruption, the first thing that kind of comes to my mind is turmoil and loss of control, and what am I going to do next? And the stories you've been telling, what it sounds like is the people that you're talking to have figured out how to, they've discovered what they really want to be anchored to. They're setting a new anchor somewhere that's not being, they're eliminating the turmoil by anchoring themselves to something new that is more important. My question is, a lot of times I get into trouble with my faith or elsewhere, not in a rapid way, but by slow drift. And I stop paying attention maybe one day to something that I should be paying attention to, and that one day turns into 3 days, it turns into a couple of weeks. Next thing I know. So are there some of your stories that talk about somebody maybe who's drifted away from what they should be anchored to and how they got back?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have one off the top of my mind, honestly, that fits that bill. I definitely have had ones where people speak into someone about whatever they're doing, showing them that whatever they're doing is not going to be sustainable, or is going to take them down a path that is lesser than the success they want to see in life. And from a secular perspective, one was Marlon Wayans. He had that situation. I don't know if you know Marlon Wayans, but he's an actor, and he grew up one of 10 kids in New York City, and of this 10, 5 of them make their money in entertainment these days. And back in the 90s, one of his brothers started In Living Color, which is a television show, and then he was on that. Then he was on the Wayans Brothers. But he was kind of just drifting along in the acting space, if you will. And within his domain, one of his brothers, Keenan Ivory Wayans, said to him, "You can't just sit and wait for the phone to ring. If you want parts, you better start writing them. You better start directing them. You better start producing them." So in that situation, although not directly to what you're speaking to, he was kind of drifting. He was kind of just going with the flow. I know from my time in the military, we would often talk about some of the biggest places to set up an ambush, or to be wary of where the enemy might have an ambush, are those areas that are just naturally easy to find yourself flowing into, right? It's that natural path that we tend to go into. It's easier to walk on the road than walk through the woods. It's easier to walk down into this valley than walk up over the terrain, but that's where the danger lies. And I'm just being wary of that. And where am I drifting? Am I taking the path of least resistance here?
Yeah.
I am so glad I'm here.
I am glad you're here too.
I didn't realize I feel aimless. I don't know how to start. I found TVC in November. I love you guys so much. You're helping me. I feel. I don't want to get into that. I have been going through a transformation for the last 2 years. 35 years ago, on this coming Sunday, I had a brain injury. I was in a coma for 3 months. I was told I would not live. Well, my parents were told I wouldn't live. Then I lived. They told my parents I was going to be retarded. I went back to college. It took me 10 years. I got a starving arts degree I don't use. I have been aimlessly moving through life, thinking I can't do anything because of the brain injury. People telling me I had to rewire my brain. I didn't figure that out till 2 years ago. How to do that. I'm finally doing it, and God is helping me so much. And I have a trainer. I'm power building. I'm down 120 pounds from 25 or 26 months ago. And I want to start making videos or doing something to help other people see that it's mindset and living intentionally. And God, it's reading. I read my Bible all the time. I walk 20,000 steps a day, and I'm always reading my Bible while I'm doing it, practically, except when I go power walking, because then I just put on the blinders.
Say, Holy Ghost, catch up. I'm moving.
I really want, my trainer keeps saying, you should read a Bible verse and put it over a video. He's giving me ideas. I'm afraid to do it. I don't know where I've been disrupted.
Yeah.
My life has been a whole, and I have so much joy now. I want to share it with the whole world. I want to go rock climbing again. I want to ask you about that too. Maybe I can just ask you guys. Anyway, I'm just so excited to be here. Do you have any advice on what I could do to get past my fear of just letting it?
Moving forward?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just putting it out there. Yeah, I mean, I'll share with you what I can, and I'd say ask 100 people and get lots of advice. But so when I first, my first book project wasn't with Jim Patterson, right? My first book project wasn't with HarperCollins, and my first book project before that was a book I wrote with Franklin Covey, and then the one before that was self-published, and the one before that was self-published, right? And I wrote a ton of things on LinkedIn that were all for free, and all that stuff is kind of part of the journey of doing it, and you bump into like people who aren't necessarily particularly scrupulous, and they're gonna it's not great, but you go through the process of doing it. But here's what I think. My mind, I'm wired in a certain way where I always think in stories. And always like stories have lessons to me, and what I can learn from it. Like I'll listen to you talk today, and I'll say, okay, what can I learn from that? How can I share that with somebody else? I mean, that's just kind of how my mind works, and I would always just do it in small groups or one-on-one, or if I'm teaching a class or whatever it might be. And in my world, at least, I knew that there were a lot of eyeballs who were reading LinkedIn. And you may or may not be familiar with LinkedIn. It's another social media platform, but it's specifically for people in the business world or out there working in organizations. It's kind of like if you think, the way I heard it described is if you think, check out this picture of me and my donut, eating a donut, that would be on Instagram. And if you're like, what's the best donut place, that might be on Facebook. But if you're like, I want to open a donut shop, that's LinkedIn, right? That's where you go and tell that. And I just started writing on LinkedIn, fully expecting the world to crush me as I started to do this 8 or 9 years ago. And it didn't. And the cool thing about it, for me at least, was, you familiar with like RAM, like random access memory, RAM in a computer, it only has so much memory? I think my mind works that way. I only have so much RAM. And then I have to dump things out of my mind and get them out, and then it frees up RAM that some other new idea comes in. So I just started just writing on LinkedIn. That was an outlet for me. I just started putting things up on LinkedIn. And I'll be darned if over the time, if you go out with the intention of one thing, which is to share an idea that might be helpful to someone, like you clearly have that desire, and I put that out into the world, guess what? It finds its way to the right people. And at this point on LinkedIn, I have about 102,000 people who follow me and read my weekly stuff. I still pay full price at Starbucks, which I thought it would be like a perk, but it's not. But the point being is, I put it out there, and I just keep putting it out there. And it's good to put good in the world. And don't be afraid to do it. Just start. Writers write. Singers sing. That's what they do. And just do it. Video producers produce videos.
That's great. We're getting close on time here, so I want to make sure that I give Patrick just this opportunity to share his creativity process. Jim, will you hand those out? And Patrick, could you just run through those 4 things for us?
I'll do it faster than I did the body parts. How's that? Okay. So what they're handing out there is a little worksheet of sorts. It's on front and back. I believe it's on front and back, right? So, when you talk about doing something creative, sometimes people are like, oh, there's no process, you just do it. And other people don't realize the process they're actually following, if you will. I mean, if you're wherever you work at or wherever you've worked at in the past, or anything you've volunteered, anything you've done in life where you've been around people who do that thing really, really well, sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it well. And if you ever try to document their process, like, tell me the steps you use to produce that widget, they skip over like 5 or 6 things, and you're kind of like, well, what about this or what about that? And they're like, well, yeah, of course you do that. Of course you do this. It's like wired into them. And what I was trying to do here is just to share some thoughts about a process you could think about for being creative. I actually made this with my friends at Franklin Covey years ago. We actually trained like 160,000 people on this particular little piece here. But the idea is that, and we called it the 8 C's of creativity.
Very clever.
Yeah. So the first one is conscious observation. And it basically just gets down to, are you paying attention to what's going on around you? You ever have that moment where you're driving down the road and you go, was that light I just went through yellow or red?
Yeah.
Right? That means you're kind of sleepwalking in that moment. And what we're saying here is, if you really want to get those creative juices flowing, you need to pay attention. You need to wonder, like, why is the last 3 restaurants I walked into, why are all the walls green? Is there something going on with green right now? Or why is the font changed on all these menus? Or why do I keep hearing that same thing? Just kind of have your radar up to pick up on things. The second one then is, you need to, we made up a word, capturize, which is capture that, what you see, and organize it in some way. And the nice thing is, with most everybody carries some type of smartphone these days. Take a photo of it, make a video of it, talk to it, make a note on it. Me, I'm still old school enough to write it down in a book. But I write down what I see that kind of catches my curiosity, and then I organize it by going through occasionally and putting a star next to it. For me, it's always like, what's the next idea for an article that I could put out next week? Because there's one thing about putting out something every week, it creates that pressure to do it. So I'm always like looking, like, what's something that's out there? The next one down is, you have to contemplate it. And this is often where truly creative people will say, like, this is where the magic happens, where you kind of just think deeply about it. Sometimes you let it go for a while and it pops back into your mind, but you're just thinking deeply about something to try to figure out what's going on. The next one is contextualize, which I'm trying to put it in perspective, like, why am I seeing things this way, or what does this mean, or how can I act on this? And then the other 4, that if you have the benefit of having that other page.
If not, get your pen out.
The other 4 is to be able to look at certain things and say, how can I cross-pollinate something that I just keep seeing or that's catching my attention into my genre, my world, whatever it might be. I have a friend who writes songs like so many people around here do, and he wrote a song called Red Solo Cup, and he thought about that song one time when he was walking by a Vanderbilt tailgate, and he saw all these cups around there, and he asked his wife, what are all these red plastic cups for? And she said, honey, it's called a Red Solo Cup. And he was like, oh, maybe there's something to that. And then the next one is clamorize, which is kind of getting down to if you're working with other people or even on yourself is wrestling with something. Then crystallizing is giving you the clarity of what you need to do. And then the last piece is critique. So it's just some ideas on there and some things you can reflect on that might be helpful to you to put some of these ideas into practice.
I think it's so helpful because everybody has their own creative practice, their own liturgy, if you will. You may not know you do, but you do. And if you don't, this is a helpful way to begin or just another resource to have if you get stuck to incorporate some of these things into your own.
Can I share one other thing to that?
Yeah,
if I
of
may? I know we're
course.
close on time, but so when I was in the military and I was in an airborne unit, we would jump out of the planes and other people's job were to repack those parachutes so that we could jump out of planes again. And those people are called riggers. And that's their job. They wear red baseball caps. You know who a rigger is. And their job is to make sure the parachutes are ready, which is like a pretty important thing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And I remember going down one time and touring where the riggers worked at. And they show you how they do their job and how they make sure everything's clean and dry. And then they pack the parachutes, et cetera. And as you might imagine, they try to create in the military a fairly low stress environment for these people.
Yeah.
Because like if some gal's packing my parachute, we want to make sure she's not overly stressed that day. So they have a quota that they have to hit every day. And I love the idea of that quota thing. I call it, for me, it's I'm going to pack X number of parachutes every day, I still say to myself, which for me is a rhythm of I'm going to write something today.
Yes.
I'm going to write something today. It might be complete trash. Oftentimes it is. Sometimes it gets through my gate of not being trash, and other people like James Patterson inform me that it's trash.
Yeah.
But I'm going to do it, right? Because that's just the discipline of doing it.
Right.
And I think that's really critical. I thought probably at one time that I'd write the next great American novel and somebody would knock on my door. That doesn't typically happen.
No.
And even if you get a publisher to give you an advance on a book, you better be ready to market this thing. Because they'll give you a marketing person and they've got 5,000 other books they're launching. And I spent a couple of summers ago, the year we hit the Wall Street Journal bestseller list, I spent every night going to bed along with my wife and other people on our team before I went to bed saying, how am I going to sell another $27.99 book tomorrow? And the next day I woke up saying, how am I going to sell another $27.99 book today?
Right.
And that's just part of the deal.
And being a writer, you have to love to write.
Most days.
But I mean, if you don't love writing, then don't be a writer.
Yeah, you got to feel like you
because
compelled.
It's hard. Yeah. You have to love the process. I have always been a fan of Annie Dillard, and I wrote to her, got to meet her, and she wrote back a little card that I have framed, and she said, being published is not what makes you a writer, writing is what makes you a writer. And it's just such a good thing to remember, no matter what your craft is, whether it is making beautiful food, whether it is making music, whether it is creating a beautiful environment for your family, whatever your craft is, that is what makes you an artist, not the affirmation of others or the success of billions of people. The sharing it with others is a part of being an artist. And so find an audience, whether that is just your friends or your neighborhood or your family or whoever that may be, that is a part of being an artist. I mean, I think that's an aspect of being fulfilled as an artist, is finding that place. But it isn't always about a huge recognition. That is lovely, but I'm always reminded there's one queen at a time. I mean, everybody wants to be queen, but there's really only one. And so you get to do your craft is really the honor. And it's the honor that you give back to the Lord if he's given you that opportunity to be an artist, to do the art. I want to just remind you of a couple of things. And I certainly want to thank Patrick. Man, I can't wait for this book. I'm looking forward
too.
to it. And you think it'll be out when?
I think next spring.
Next spring. All right. Well, we'll look forward to that and perhaps have you come back and sign copies for us. Maybe you and Jim
Sure.
could pop in. I'll speak with him.
I saw something. He's gonna be at Vanderbilt. He's gonna be speaking at Vanderbilt on the 11th.
Oh, is that right?
11th April, I think. Yeah.
Well, then why not? If there, why not here?
He's
in the family room of the Village
He's actually
Chapel.
speaking in my class on Monday.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'll be there and just do a little winsome invitation.
Exactly. Yeah,
All right, we can make this happen. But until then, I pray that you will go and make what no one else is making, say what no one else is saying, go where no one else is going, and be who God has made you to be, because he said it is good. So until the next time, thanks for being here, and thank you again, Patrick.